Why the U.S. gave up on public transit. This is a suggestion via Patreon, guys. Let's just go ahead and theorize for a moment. Oil and gas industry is an absolutely gigantic industry. Even though in the early 1900s, everyone was basically riding trains cross country, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? Later on, Route 66 started being pushed towards the American public. Car manufacturers were also getting larger and larger and larger from the 1920s to 60s, guys, right? So all of these things, honestly, changed the way we get around. Even though public transit is cheaper to run, there are more people that would have the ability or access to mobility, right? But I wonder why. I mean, obviously capitalism, but either way, let's go and jump into it.
17 minutes. That's how long Americans had to wait on average to get on public transit in 2022.
Transit in the U.S. is awful, with few exceptions in a few places. It's infrequent, it's not all day, it's unreliable.
Meanwhile, 45% of Americans have no access to public transportation at all.
The real problem in the U.S. is what I would call transit deserts, right? I mean, these are just places where it is just complete and total nightmare to try to get anywhere on transit, whether to work or, to play, to pick up your kids. You just can't depend on it.
The U.S. spent
Really quickly, guys, the majority of the neighborhoods that I've lived in my life have absolutely been that. All under the excuse of this. Is what the local mayors would say. Public transportation allows access to people that generally wouldn't be in your area, right? But by allowing access to public transportation, now these people, I'm trying to be nice here, guys, because the mayor, when he said it, he wasn't very nice. I think he literally called them undesirables, guys. He brings these people into this area. This area's property value starts to drop, right? All while the larger city surrounding the area was kind of yelling at the town I was living in at the time, guys, openly. Like, bring the public transit to this area. It can help a whole lot of people. My mayor didn't care.
$29 billion on public transit in 2019.
There's still no public transit in that area.
The nation is finding itself in a fiscal crisis. In 2021, the U.S. was $176 billion behind in updating the poor conditions of public transit. That backlog is expected to grow to $250 billion by the year 2029. Ultimately, it's the riders who are paying for the deficit.
The pandemic money is going to run out. And so there will be, I think there will be fare increases, but even more, I think because of the politics of it, there will be service reduction. And many places have predicted that.
So just how did public transit in the U.S. get so awful? And can it be improved? The U.S. government and services quickly began to deteriorate as a result.
When the streetcar companies, which were private, went to the government and so forth and said, please help us, city governments, state governments, and of course the federal government wasn't involved at all in this period, basically turned a blind eye. By
the end of World War I, a third of transit companies were already in bankruptcy. And America had found its newest obsession: cars.
People who wanted to sell more cars reframed the car as an all-purpose transport necessity instead of a special purpose mobility tool. And when they turned it into that, they really convinced a lot of people that you need this to go everywhere and that you're not living in a modern, progressive city until it's a city that lets you drive everywhere.
And with the influx of money and aid from policies, cities began to quickly transform around cars.
They forced private transit companies whenever possible to strip out the streetcar lines. They created all these one-way streets to speed up automobiles. They built parkways. They built highways.
And when people said, wait a minute, is this really the right way to do it? The answer was, it's just supply and demand. It's a free market. Drivers are voting with their gas pedals, and we need to build the roads and streets for the people who are paying for them.
There is a kind of a time lag between public investment in highway infrastructure versus transit infrastructure in our nation. There was at least 40 to 50 years of lag, and the federal government did not get into public transportation funding programs until late 1960s.
Today, that disparity is more evident through partisan differences. The ratio in which funding is distributed between highways and public transit became the main point of contention over the 2021 infrastructure bill.
Guys, this will always be this, guys. I think most politicians look at it as the haves and have-nots, basically, right? You have the money to purchase a car, why do you need public transportation, right? And then at the same time, they're like, oh, these people are probably not going to vote for me because they don't make the capital, right? Most likely. So public transportation it is. That's kind of how that's working, guys. It's like it's purely about haves and have-not here.
Democrats wanted just 20% of the budget to go towards mass transit, while Republicans pushed for less.
Right.
Democrats eventually compromised to pass the bill through the Senate.
We have identified the automobile with personal individual liberty. We also associate driving particularly with suburban and rural America, while public transit we associate with urban America. Those correlations then bleed into
politics.
Correlations of similar
Absolutely.
Kinds
because the ones who are riding the public transit are most likely not to the majority, overwhelming majority, are most likely not going to be right-leaning versus the people who, well, there are more chances of people driving cars, right, who would be, right?
Fostering
that's
more
what that is.
driving
It's all politics.
Something that's favored in more conservative, more Republican, more rural areas.
A study from 2021 revealed that 77% of liberal respondents believe that transport policy should shift more trips towards public transit, walking, and bicycling, while 53% of conservatives believe that transport policy should make it easier for most people to drive.
Bro, I didn't even need to see this chart.
Discrepancy was even higher with very liberal or conservative respondents.
It's very hard politically to get that kind of momentum. Cities are a little bit easier, but states, very hard to get that suburban voter who is very powerful in almost every state legislature. Very hard to get federal officials behind this because, again, the payoff politically, because it's a relatively small number of users, very small. It can be 1%, 2%, 3% in most cities. That's not the loud voices. The loud voices are going to be the drivers.
Funding is one of the main reasons behind the poor state of public transit in the U.S.
Right now, the federal money that goes to transit services is largely limited to the capital costs. That means, building the infrastructure or buying the vehicles. But the operating costs are where the transit services are really pinched.
Public transit relies heavily on subsidies because it's still far from a profitable business. Take the MTA, the nation's largest public transit, for example. In 2022, less than a quarter of the MTA's revenue came from rider fares. By comparison, revenue from dedicated taxes and subsidies from local governments made up 40% of its total revenue.
The cost of living, the cost of operations, the cost of construction, all of that over the last, 40, 50 years has far exceeded what is collected in fares.
Current subsidies simply aren't enough to cover the costs.
Right.
The MTA's finances were
failing
hit
business
hard
model.
by the pandemic, resulting in temporary aid from the federal government. Yet it still reported a budget deficit of $1.9 billion in 2022. This problem extends beyond New York City. Philadelphia's SEPTA predicts it will see a deficit of almost $269 million by 2027.
Right.
Chicago's RTA predicts a budget gap of $730 million by 2026. While LA Metro's...
Guys, and it's not like you can just raise the price of these tickets, guys. Think about that for a second. You can't. I'm sure there will be some who would be like, the price is already too high. They're running a failing business, but is it too high if they were to shut down tomorrow? Because of this deficit? Guys, not a single city in America can deal with that. I mean, don't get me wrong, they probably have been dealing with it since the beginning of time, in a sense, right? But I think it should probably be a little bit more expensive, just so they can kind of mitigate some of that loss. That loss is enough to bankrupt a city, right? Fortunately, the cities that they're talking about they've listed so far, are not broke cities.
Budget gap of $730 million by
I would love to see Detroit public transit.
While LA Metro's budget gap expects to reach $1 billion by the end of 2026. These financial deficits lead directly to deteriorating services.
Absolutely.
If a transit system doesn't have enough money, we can limit the hours of service, we can limit the frequency of service, we can limit the extent of the network. But all of those things also deter ridership and encourage people to depend on their car.
In a 2022 survey on incentives around public transit, Americans chose accurate and reliable arrival times as the second biggest reason that would encourage them to use public transit more often, right behind lower fares.
Public transportation is so expensive to run in the United States is because of the lack of usage. Mass transit need mass to be successful.
Ridership has continuously declined since 2015. And after seeing a steep drop during the
I mean, guys, this right here is obvious. This was during the 19, guys. That's a pretty obvious one. And they still have not even crept back up. I'm guessing this is still some type of like fear, most likely still. They just don't want to be around people. Or also, so many people just dropped off that they started driving. That's what happened, guys. 100%.
the pandemic, ridership has failed to recover to its previous levels.
It's a vicious cycle, right? If we have less users, less riders, it's difficult to justify significant public investment in that system. And therefore, it's become more difficult to provide quality service. And
Absolutely.
because you have a lack of quality of service, you will continue to have lack of users and riders.
If the riders are either insufficient in number or do not provide a fare, right, that covers those costs, you have to make up that money in public subsidies. And in the United States, the structure of funding for public transit is insufficient to basically really make up for that missing enormous chunk of money to fund operations and capital.
But a thriving public transit system is beneficial for all Americans.
Okay,
The
sell
American
it to
Public
me.
Transportation Association estimates that 87% of trips on transit directly benefit the local economy, with nearly $42 billion in transit
Right.
spending going directly to
That's
the
a good
private
one.
sector. A dollar invested in public transit is believed to generate $5 in economic returns.
I mean, look what happened with Amazon. Where did Amazon locate its new, second headquarters, right? Right where one of the better, mass transit systems operate. Transit is really great for an employer because it gives them more options, right, in terms of labor.
We
Right.
can connect people to employment opportunities, including people
Very, very
who
smart.
can't necessarily afford an automobile, which is a very expensive thing both to buy and to operate and maintain.
When you
Right.
don't have transportation, everything else become a domino effect. You may end up with not able to connect with your family and friends, not able to go to doctor appointments, and not able to have a good income to sustain your house.
And in the end, it can even benefit the drivers themselves.
The more we attract people into rail or buses or other forms of public transit, the fewer people are driving on the roads, and that makes driving better for people who want to drive.
Ultimately, the future of public transit relies on whether it can receive the proper investment needed to improve services.
To break the vicious cycle, we need a significant investment from the federal government. I mean, I don't think just with local innovations we can solve this problem of this magnitude.
We'd have to spend a lot of money up front in order to get systems that cost a lot less to operate because you'd have more robust ridership.
Cities can also be reimagined and redesigned to
They would
better
have
serve
to.
public transit.
Yeah, guys, they
The
would
kind of
have to be
density levels
rebuilt.
that most American suburbs have very difficult to serve
Yeah,
effectively
right.
by transit,
That's-
even buses. You have
And that's the point right there, right? Like, in order for the federal government to step in and be like, hey, here, throw money at you, right? The masses would absolutely have to, while the masses do not live in cities, right? They live in like small towns or just like smaller cities, if that makes any sense, right? Where there is literally no public transit. Even in the city that I am in, when I am in the United States of America, it has no public transportation. None. Bro, I'm trying to think, where could you put a train? Nowhere. Bro, you'd have to literally, like, eminent domain things, guys, I think, potentially, right? And have fun with that, because, listen, I will sell my piece of land at top dollar. I don't care what you say, right? top dollar, absolutely. So the point is that I have no idea where they're going to put it. And the buses, I don't think a bus could even work where I am, bro. I just don't see the purpose of it, right? Every single person around me has a car, multiple cars, kind of, guys. So I just don't know. How are you going to convince the masses of Americans who live in suburbs to wreck their areas with public transit? What I mean by wreck it, I mean just like they're eyesores also, guys. I mean, property value is important. I just don't see people throwing away their equity for this.
Have to create
It would be
more dense
great if we
neighborhoods,
could
and
figure out a way
particularly,
out.
This is really important.
A subway
You
or
have
something.
to change the zoning and the density around transit.
I conceptualize public transportation as a public space. If you think about in a city, how much space we have really help people with different background come together. There is a diminishing number of places that we have in our city. If we have a good public transportation system, it's like the core spaces for people with different background, different class, different gender, race, ethnicity to interact and to encounter. And I think that's very important for the future of our society.
It is. Listen, don't get me wrong, right? I mean, I understand. I love the concept of a city. I like visiting them, but I also like leaving pretty quickly. Right? Generally, American cities at least, right? Very different than European cities when I'm in Europe, right? They're very, very different. Public transit in, for example, where I live in Spain, Malaga, it's everywhere. It's everywhere. But those cities were kind of built for that, if that makes sense. Well, no, they weren't. No, I'm sorry. They were not built for that, but those things fit in so well, almost, right? Because the city I live in was really old and they never really dug down, so you could easily start building subways at a certain depth, right? So there are subways that take you all around, right? It is an extremely, like Costa del Sol, that whole region, right? Right across from Morocco. It is extremely public transitable. If that's even a word, it isn't. I don't think so. But you get what I'm saying here. There are places that have been able to make it work. I just don't think America is going to be one of those places because we have absolutely dug basements. Some people have multi-level basements. Sewage underneath their yards, guys. We have a lot of issues with popping these in. I mean, I'm sure we can if we dig deep enough, but I guess depending on where you are in the United States of America, hopefully you're not near any type of aquifer or anything like that, but maybe you can kind of fit in some type of subway system. That would probably be the only way to do it, right? And it would have to be deep, like very deep. If that was it, then I'm sure many people would be like, okay, right? It just cannot, under any circumstance, lower like the property values. Then you can get more people on your side. Absolutely. But all right, listen, you guys all have an absolutely amazing day and enjoy your day thoroughly.